I'm going to look at it at another scale. The Choose Lane development, Alistair also showed an image of this. On the left, you can see a red box coming out. That's part of the development opening out to Willis Street in Wellington. Above, you can see a curved facade, which is about 10 floors of apartments right in the central city. And then if we move over to the right at street level, we can see some signs with red flags and lights, and the lights on in the shops there leading into Choose Lane. Now, this is two things I'd like to say about this project. One thing before I get to the connectivity. This is a mixed-use development in the central city. Retail at ground, about 5 floors of offices, and over 100 apartments up the top. And it's proving to be extremely successful. The link is an existing lane, which prior to this was a service lane. It was grotty. There was nothing happening along it apart from rubbish bins. There were the back doors of shops, and now it has been transformed. It makes quite an important link through from Willis Street towards the waterfront. Now, the sun was so bright in Wellington on Friday morning that the camera couldn't register the brightness of the rowing clubs in the distance in the shot on the left. But what you can see, what's necessary to make a link like this work, the activity along the edge. The whole series on the left-hand side, a whole series of cafes or mainly cafes. There are 3 cafes and there's a shop. On the right, there is the back of one shop. There is the main entrance to the apartments, and there's a major restaurant. And then coming out the other side, you can see the entrance to the restaurant, you can see the cyclist, you can see another shop there. So it's a very vibrant place, attractive and safe. So some of the conditions to make links work. Now, sometimes there can be too much connectivity. If a link goes through a block and there is no activity on the edges of there are no activities on the edge of that link, it can be unsafe, it can be unpleasant. If there are too many links like that, basically you're taking people through the private backs of buildings, you start to get security concerns. This can happen in housing developments as well. You wouldn't necessarily take a public path through your back garden. The same principle applies in other sorts of development. You want to have buildings fronting the public space. And of course, you can sometimes dilute the pedestrian flows so that it's hard to make commercial activity work. Now, the fourth thought is understand and consider the context. Pretty obvious. What's happening around your site in terms of activity and character, and how does the project relate to that? Now, from an urban design perspective, it may complement, it may be consistent, it may contrast, but that context must always be considered. Now, I'm showing a building by Frank Gehry, not to be provocative, but to make a point. Gehry explicitly considers context, and he knows when to express the special character of a building. This is the Wiseman Art Museum in Minneapolis. And I quote Gehry, "The way we work is to make models of the context that the buildings are going to be in. We pretty thoroughly document it because that gives me visual clues. For instance, in an art gallery project, I wandered around the streets and I found that all of the public buildings were brick and all the private buildings were plaster. Since this is a public building, I decided to make it brick because that's the language of the town. I also had models of the existing buildings so that when I put the existing building into the site model, I could see that it was going to be, the new building into the site model, I could see that it was going to be a comfortable fit in the neighbourhood. It wasn't going to be too big and it wasn't going to be too small, it was going to be just right." So even Gehry, doing this sort of thing, he explicitly considers context, which is a real urban design approach. Now, considering context is not dumbing down and copying. And I repeat that, it is not dumbing down and copying. You can consider alignments, you and get commonality of frontage alignments, look at separation distances between and repeat that, and perhaps have similar overall dimensions. And then there's some scope for difference in the architectural theme, in the detail, the form, and the fenestration. In this case, an example from Melbourne, close to central Melbourne, I photographed about 3 or 4 years ago. There's also material reference, but the building on the left fits very well next to the row of much older buildings on the right, yet the building on the left is definitely contemporary. It's even bigger, much bigger. Now, I could offer the thought as well that there are some places where a consistency of age, a consistency of building age often correlates with a consistency of character. And in urban design terms, that's where often character controls are applied. Perhaps the inner suburbs of cities, which represents probably only about 5 to 10% of the housing stock, and other places where there's a varied age profile, there are often varied building types, varied building styles, and that's where difference can more readily be accommodated. Sometimes structures need to be absolutely of their time. Now, we know here that Norman Foster was pushing technology and design to the limit, in fact past the limit, because they had to close the bridge and put dampers on it to stop it vibrating successfully. But it's very much in keeping, because all of the other bridges over the Thames in London are of their time. And this is definitely 2000 as opposed to 1900. So we need to think about the context of time and culture as well as place. So the fifth thought is to celebrate the past. Now, you may be wondering why I'm showing you a slide of Waitangi Park in Wellington, which is a very highly contemporary piece of landscape design which has won multiple awards from this institute and also the Landscape Institute and international awards. But this does learn from the past. Go back a stage. Aldo Rossi, in his writings on the city, wrote about the city as collective memory. And he said, wrote words to the effect, a city without a history is like a man without a memory. So effectively saying that it's the richness of traces of what's happened in the past which gives richness to the city in the future. Now here we see in this piece of design by Rayton Associates and Athfield Architects a number there are 4 main references. The graving dock, that is the diagonal water space that goes up to the top left corner of the plan. That follows the exact dimensions and alignment of a graving dock which was built. They started building it in 1905. They filled it in 1908 when they couldn't make the concrete go off 20 metres underwater at the time. There are still traces of it there, so that's a reference to that graving dock element. The park reveals the old Waitangi stream and lagoon. The shape of the green field represents the beach which was once there. Then on the lower side of that field, there's a crescent-shaped space, and you can start to see some little white lines which are pathways through into the field, and they are the ghosts of Waka. Now, very subtle references to where Waka were drawn up against the beach. So that's referencing back in a very, very abstract way to what was happening in the past. Now, from an ecological perspective, the designers here chose all indigenous plants, and there are many of them in the wetlands and so on, are locally sourced. They are local species with seed stock from the Wellington region. There are some exotic trees as well, because this is a city, there's a mix of European culture and local Maori culture. So the point here is these authentic references root the project in the culture and time and place, and it's not pastiche. Urban designers do not wish to see pastiche. If they do, you should question them. An example of celebrating the past is Berlin. This notion of critical reconstruction in Berlin. Berlin, about 60% of its fabric was destroyed in World War II. Then in the following 25 years, another 25% of it was taken for motorway projects. Buildings had to be torn down because they were structural risks and so on. So they were left with about 15% of, in the early 80s, they had about 15% of their fabric left. And they decided they were losing their city. So they took this approach of critical reconstruction, which was to build to the street plan of 1914. Now that seems like an incredibly backward-looking, at first sight may seem like an incredibly backward-looking approach, but they valued what had happened in their city. They certainly didn't want to look back to the 1940s or the 1930s. 1915 wasn't great. Germany had been an aggressor, so they had to go back to 1914 and use that as the basis for filling in the gaps in the city, because there were massive gaps.